Yay! There we go. Fan mail Friday. Let's see. There we go. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another Friday. How about that? Friday came round again after a full week. Hi, Carol. Nice you could join us for our Fan Mail Fridays. This is getting to be quite the process with our lists of questions and some interesting answers. I'm really kind of getting intrigued. There's Anne saying hi. Tina's with us this afternoon. That's lovely. Balmy 20 degrees, but a bit cloudy here in Calgary. If we have any out of towners joining us, we're just going to give a few minutes to let everybody tune in who's wanting to tune in, and just remind you that it is officially the 27th of May, so you have a couple of days left to get your May Viewers Challenge in, working with felt. Diane's asking about the fabric behind me. Yes, that is brand new. In fact, Chelsea had to take the plastic wrapping off of it and put it up behind us. This is Jennifer Sampu's new Sky line. So if you love ombres, and I love ombres, this is spectacular. So some of the warm colors, we haven't opened up the browns and beiges, but really different. Maybe sometime we'll do a little spot on how to use ombres in your quilts. But for someone like me that likes to cut things up in little bitty pieces and do applique, it's like buying 3 meters of fabric in a quarter meter because you get all those colors. So yes, it is Friday again, so Fan Mail Friday. And just wanted to let you know that we are getting your questions. We are getting answers to your questions. We can't always give the answer to everybody's question in one session, but I'm going to let you know when your question is maybe postponed until we can really delve into it. So coming up, and this is a couple of questions from last time, coming up in the next couple of weeks. This is something to look forward to. Thread, needles, and fabric and their relationships. We had a question on that a week or so ago. So Leah is going to be delving into that on June the 2nd. I think that's a Thursday for our Tools and Techniques Thursday. And we had another question or inquiry, really, about some more information on the scan and cut. And Chelsea is going to do a little spot on the scan and cut and what it can do for you on June the 9th. So those are two things that we've got scheduled coming up in the next couple of weeks in response to our Fan Mail Friday questions. So what I'm going to do is run through some of the more recent questions that have more simple answers. They're not always simple answers, but a little more simple answers. So Carol D was actually asking a couple of things regarding classes, and I checked with Leah. So what we used to call quilting first class or a learn to quilt class, we are planning on scheduling something like that over the summer. Obviously, it's going to be recorded for future use as well as in class. So if you have someone or maybe yourself, if you want to hone your skills and learn to do it the right way, don't talk to me about the right way. Hi, Donna. Um, then keep an eye on our class schedule because that's going to be popping up in there fairly soon. So sometime July, August, as well as our new owners classes. There are a lot of people who bought new sewing machines over the last couple of years. Some of those machines, obviously, we walk you through things before they go out of the store, but some of those machines had a new owners segment already recorded, and some of them did not. So Leah's going to be scrambling. She wants to record a lot more videos on new owners, as well as actually running in-person new owners classes. Apparently it's a lot easier when you're here because we can have several different machines at the table at the same time. So that's coming up as well in the summertime. Just keep an eye on our newsletter. I'm sure we'll mention it in our Facebook feeds and our YouTube feeds on that. So something to look forward to while away those summertime hours. Teresa had a question about her VQ3000 Dreamweaver brother sewing machine. What I've got on the table in front of me today is a Luminaire. So we did a little investigating for you, Teresa, this morning, and we discovered that there are a number of stitches, built-in stitches in that machine that they just don't want to back up. They do not want to stitch backwards. When you press the reverse sew button, all it will do is take a tacking stitch. So your straight stitches are generally pretty good. Your zigzags are generally pretty good. All of your simple basics. But even when we switch to like a blanket stitch, it would not back up your blanket stitch. So that's something that's actually programmed into your machine. The machine will do some tacking stitches, but if you wish to actually back up, you may have to raise your needle, switch to a straight stitch, and stitch backwards a few stitches if necessary. If that poses a problem for whatever you're trying to accomplish, then give us a phone call or stop by the store and we'll see if we can work around that feature in your machine. Heather was asking about anchoring stitches when you're quilting. And Heather's working on a Q16, which is a Bernina sit-down, long-ish arm, mid-arm they call them. And she was asking about anchoring stitches when you're starting and stopping. So Heather, if you're listening today or you're catching us on video, that is a question that I think I'm going to demo at a later date because it can tie in beautifully to some basic free motion work, maybe some thread painting, something else that's fun and exciting. It's really very simple. Bring your bobbin thread up and you're totally free motion. I like to just go zip, zip. That'll anchor your stitches. But we'll be able to demo that in a future session. And Anne had a question about tearing fabric. So I thought this was worth talking about today while it's fresh in my mind. Why do we want to tear fabric? Well, primarily, and this goes back to the old days of making clothing, we were taught to tear the fabric so that we would get it on the straight grain. That's fine if you're working with a large piece of fabric. Let's say you come into our not quite such a mystery sale, clearance sale we're having next week, and you buy the perfect backing fabric and there's like 8 meters of it. And so when you go to use it, maybe you only want 2 meters worth. So you measure off, I'd go 2.2, 2.3, clip the selvage and give it a tear, separating large pieces of fabric. It's a start. Unfortunately, not all fabrics tear well. Our quilting cottons do. And I find it distorts that edge of the fabric a fair bit. Is it really important to you to have that fabric really on the straight grain? Or is it more important to have it cut straight? So if you want to tear off a piece of fabric, you're still going to have to cut that straight with your rotary cutter and your ruler in order to get it appropriate for quilting with. If you're making clothing and you want that clothing to hang beautifully, you definitely want the straight grain of the fabric to work with. So you need to know where it is. So tearing is appropriate. If it's a delicate fabric or you're not sure if you're strong enough to tear it across, you can always go back to, anybody remember home ec? A drawn thread. Pull out, make a little cut in along your selvage, find a thread, gradually pull it out. That will give you a straight, grain straight line to cut on. So personally, I wouldn't bother with it unless I was just having to separate a whole whack of fabric. I don't like how it distorts the fabric when you tear it, but it is kind of fun. The other place I might tear fabric is if I wanted really thin strips of fabric for weaving and I wanted all the shaggy ends. But that's a different class. I would not try to tear fabric that has paint on the top surface, so metallics. The tone-on-tone, those tone-on-tone whites, some of them have a fair bit of a painted feeling surface. Probably not going to tear as easily. Strangely enough, one thing we used to tear, you don't see it around at our store too much, but I know it is still available out there at more general fabric stores, is fun fur. Fur fabric with a woven backing. Not your stretchy stuff like our cuddle or our fireside, but an actual fur fabric that you maybe want to make Halloween costumes out of. Tears beautifully. You got to have muscles, but you can tear it across there just perfectly. So hopefully that answers your questions. Happy Friday to you too, Billy, and hi to Loanne and another Anne joining us today. It's lovely to see everybody on a Friday. So what are we going to talk about today in response to our viewers' questions? Tina was asking, it was Tina, I think. Let's check my book. We had a question about how to quilt as you go, or quilting smaller pieces of your quilt and joining them together. So I'm going to show you a couple things that I've discovered over the last week or so in that regard. And what we titled it is, well, how do you quilt that giant quilt? And you know that sometimes we start off and we think, I'm just going to make a lap quilt. And before we know it, it's king size. And so now we're faced with quilting it. So the easiest answer is put it in a bag, buy some backing fabric, bring it into me, and I'll quilt it for you. That's the easiest way. But a lot of times people want not responsibility, they want to do the whole thing themselves, and that's amazing. So obviously, if you're quilting that giant king-size quilt under your domestic sewing machine, that can be a bit of a challenge. So I've listed a few points. If you really want to do it on your domestic machine, just understand it's going to be a slow process. You've got all that fabric that you're going to have to bunch up, and so you're going to be quilting little patches at a time. I've done it. It works. It's maybe not fun, and you need a good chiropractor. The other easy way to do it, I brought a small sample because this is what I'm doing right now. You can quilt it by hand. This is a smaller piece, but I love hand quilting. So that way you just layer it, spray baste it, put some pins in it, lay it across your lap, bring it in, and we can actually baste your quilt for you if you enjoy hand quilting. That's not a problem. So that's an option for quilting some of the larger pieces. You can lay it out and literally stitch it by hand. Maybe it's not something you enjoy, not something you can do. Maybe it's hard on the fingers. So the next option, you want to do your own free motion quilting. We have a machine in our long arm studio called a Q20. It's a Bernina long arm machine but it's in a big table. So we open out the leaves on it. You have 20 inches throat space to quilt in. You can rent time on that machine for $25 an hour, and you don't need any training. You just phone me up and we'll book you on there, no problem. Bring in your quilt. So now you have ownership of the quilting designs and a lot more space to work in. So I think that's going to be a really good answer for a lot of people who want to quilt the bigger quilt, but still don't have the space on a standard domestic machine. If you really want to get into quilting larger quilts, you feel you're going to be making a lot more of them, consider taking our renter certification and renting time on the movable machine. That's a fast way, much faster way of quilting a large quilt. And I think the results are really good, and we're always there to help you with them. So there's several options to begin with. How do you quilt if you want to work in sections? So we did a little investigating. Sometimes you're making a larger piece, but you have the option of making it in smaller sections and joining them together. So let's say you have 2 foot by 2 foot, 20 inches, something like that, pieces of your quilt. You have them quilted, but now you need to know how to join them together. So I did a little sample up to show you. That's the front side. I know it was just a test run. That's the back side. And I will show you how quick and easy it is to achieve that with some pre-quilted samples. So I've got something a little smaller because we don't want to spend all our time just stitching things together. So what you're going to do, and this is the traditional, not really quilt as you go, but that's kind of what they're calling it. Quilt as you go is basically almost like a stitch and flip. But this is, I actually enjoy doing that little sample. It's kind of a fun technique. And I might be inclined to use it on even smaller quilts, baby quilts and that sort of thing. You're going to take 2 pieces of your quilt, right, like that. Trim them off nice and straight, the edges you want to join. You're going to cut a strip of fabric that will go on the back of your quilt that's 1 inch wide, just like that. And you're going to cut another strip of fabric that will go on the front of your quilt that is, just like our binding fabric, is 2.5 inches wide. You're going to press that in half, just like as if you were making a binding strip. Once you get that all set, I'm going to switch cameras. We're going to go right up here. Yep. Make sure that's it. So this is the front of my quilt. I'm going to take one piece and I'm going to take my 1 inch strip of fabric and lay it along the edge. If you have a bigger piece, obviously you can use some pins. So that's raw edge to raw edge, just like that. I'm going to take my front strip and raw edges to raw edges, I'm going to lay that on the front side, like that. You see that? And now I'm going to, one may wish to use pins if one is working with a larger piece. So we're going to wing it for Facebook, aren't we? All right, we're going to take it over to the sewing machine. There we go. And we're going to stitch through all the layers. And a walking foot is probably a good idea for this this process, but I didn't have one to put on, so we're just going with a standard foot. Lower the foot and a standard 1/4 inch seam on that. So here we go. I would also, let me see, what have we got? Stitch length at 2.5. I might be inclined to use a slightly longer stitch than average. There we go. Uh-oh, come here. Where's my pivot? There we go. That should work. That's better. I love these Brother machines. I love the pivot feature on them. When I take my foot off of the foot pedal, the needle stays in the fabric, and you can set it so the presser foot lifts a little. There we go. So now you can see this is the back side, and I have my little strip of fabric stitched on there. And on the front, I have my wider strip stitched onto the front. I could then cut off the excess just to keep it out of the way. Now I want to take my other piece of fabric that I'm joining, whoop, this way over, that way, there. This is what I want to join. Perfect. And right sides together. What I did with my sample is I made sure, and I took this little back piece and I pressed that down. So stretch that out nicely. This is going to stitch onto there. So I'm going to lay that just like that. And I want to make sure, of course, that the pieces are even. Square them up nicely. So now you can see there's not a lot of fabric there to stitch, but there's enough to get under your presser foot. And that top strip is still tucked out of the way. There we go. That's lined up, that's lined up. Everything's set. And again, just a 1/4 of an inch seam. There we go. So now our pieces are joined together on the back, just like that. And when I lay that flat, you can probably see it in that camera, the two edges of the quilt pieces pretty much butt together, just like that, nice and flat. They're not overlapping, so there's no bigger lump there. It's laying nice and smooth. Now I can take this piece, and we want these strips to be decorative, so you're going to plan it around the colors of your quilt. We're going to fold that over. Because this is a folded edge, it's a nice clean edge. So now comes the design decisions. Depending on what you're making the quilt for, who's going to get it, how you want it to look, you have a choice. You could hand stitch that edge down just like you would with a piece of binding on the back side. Or if we're working on a quilt for maybe a young one who really isn't that particular, you can just pop it back under the machine and stitch carefully right along the edge. I'm using a straight stitch, but decoratively you could use any decorative machine stitch you feel like. There we go. So that's how that comes out. It looks neat. If personally, I would probably run another row of stitching along here just so the edges look the same. But that's me. Or I might hand stitch that edge. Nice, neat, finished on both sides. The only downside, and this has to do with matching your thread, is that line of stitching is going to show on the back side of your quilt. So match your bobbin thread to your quilt backing, and that shouldn't matter. It's all part of the process. So that's how it's done. Whether you choose to use it or not is completely up to you. But I think it certainly has potential like this to join together pre-quilted pieces of fabric that are going to be too cumbersome to work through your home machine. So there's your options. You've got that giant quilt. Maybe it's not put together, maybe it is put together. There's some different ways of getting it quilted. Any of those, feel free. Bring it in to see me and we'll talk about them. We'll show you some examples of how to tackle some of these sort of frustrating little things that we come up against. And yeah, we'll have fun. We'll have fun quilting and learning new techniques. I kind of like this technique. It's not too often I try something for the first time and it actually works. I usually have to do a little refining on things. So that's what we have for you for today's Fan Mail Friday. By all means, keep the questions coming in. As you work through your day in your sewing room, if something occurs to you, send us off a quick email, social@mysewingroom.ca, and we'll be happy to track down the answers for you. Sometimes it might take a little bit longer, but we all love learning new things, and we like to learn along with you. So thank you for joining me on this Fan Mail Friday. We will be back with you next week. Can't remember. I know I'm doing Friday next week. And keep an eye out for, I think it's 27th, so Leah's thread, needles, and fabric combinations on June 2nd will be the next thing coming up. Have a great weekend, everybody. I'm glad you could join me, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Hi, Tina.